I just completed building an entire set of custom interior doors for our home. Now when I built these doors, I knew that I was going to have some pretty strong joinery to assemble them. So I chose mortise and tenon. A typical mortise and tenon joint consists of a rail and a stile. The rail has the tenon on it, and then the stile has the mortise on it. One disadvantage of mortise and tenon joinery is that there's quite a few steps involved. The tenon is usually cut on the table saw. You'll cut the shoulder with a standard saw blade, and then change to a dado stack to cut the tenon itself. Then you have to cut the mortise. That means marking the mortise location out on the edge of the board, taking the board over to the drill press, drilling a series of overlapping holes, and then you have to get out your chisels to square up all the corners. Once you've got all that done, now you can apply glue to both the tenon and the mortise itself, fit it together, clamp it up, and now you've got a really strong joint. Now I've done quite a few mortise and tenon joints on several projects, and like I said before, it takes quite a few steps. So since I had so many doors to build, including some doors for some custom cabinets, I wanted to find an easier way. So I decided to go with loose tenon joinery. So let's take a look at how that works. So just like a mortise and tenon joint, it consists of a tenon and a mortise, but now the tenon floats. So what that requires is that you actually cut a mortise in both the end of the rail and the edge of the stile. Now you'll notice that these mortises are round, and that's because we're using a router and a jig to cut those mortises. The router bit itself is a 1/4 inch spiral upcut straight bit. When that mortise is cut, it leaves round ends. Now I could go on ahead and get out the chisels again and square these up, but there's no need to do that. There's an easier way. Instead, on the tenon itself, we just round over both edges of the tenon. Now I have a tenon that fits into that slot perfect. And just like mortise and tenon, I can apply glue to the tenon itself and then both mortises, fit this joint together, clamp it up, and now I have a joint that's every bit as strong as traditional mortise and tenon. Now if you're going to choose to do this type of joinery, it takes a few tools. We have straight bits, a plunge router, and a mortising jig. Let's talk about the straight bits first. For 3/4 inch stock, I chose to use the 1/4 inch spiral upcut bit. That's going to cut a 1/4 inch slot, and that means that I need to make 1/4 inch tenons. Now if I want to go to a thicker stock, I'm going to switch to a different bit. So let's take a look at this 5/4 stock, which is actually 1 1/16 of an inch thick. You'll notice that now our tenons are a little bigger, and so are our mortises, and that's to accommodate for the thickness of the stock. For 5/4, I actually went with a 3/8 inch spiral upcut bit. So that cuts a 3/8 inch mortise on the end of our rail, and then a 3/8 inch wide mortise on the stile. That means that the tenons are 3/8 of an inch thick, and they get a 3/16 inch round over on both sides. Now if I want to go to even thicker stock, like 1.5 inches thick, then I go to an even larger bit, and that's the 1/2 inch spiral upcut bit. Now in this case, I can only cut mortises so long with this jig. So I've chosen to go with twin tenons and mortises on this piece since it's so wide. So just like the 5/4, we're cutting 1/2 inch mortises on the rail and 1/2 inch mortises on the stile. And then we have 1/2 inch thick tenons. Now these tenons require 1/4 inch roundovers on both edges to match the mortise. You'll also notice that this particular tenon is made out of plywood. And that's because I wanted a little stronger tenon than what I could get with this Douglas fir. And since this Douglas fir is architectural grade, I didn't want to waste any stock to make those tenons. So it's perfectly okay to use different materials for the tenons themselves. Now let's talk a little bit more about these straight bits. So if we compare a spiral upcut bit to a typical straight bit, you'll notice that the shape of the bit itself is a spiral shape. That allows the bit to shear the wood rather than chop the wood like a regular straight bit. The other thing is that this shape also lends itself to lifting the wood up out of the mortise as you cut it, so it ejects all the waste as it cuts. The other great thing about these bits is that they're solid carbide and they last a long time. They can also be used for all kinds of other things as well. You can use them anywhere you'd normally use a straight bit. Since they shear the wood, they're perfect for working with delicate surfaces like veneered plywoods or difficult woods like architectural grade Douglas fir, which tends to chip out easy. Now let's talk about the router itself that we're going to use. This particular router came with two bases. Came with the fixed base and the plunge base. For this particular jig, we want to make sure and use the plunge router base. And that's because the plunge router allows you to actually plunge down into the cut. It also allows you to make multiple passes. So in other words, if I'm using a 1/4 inch straight bit, I can lower this down to a 1/4 inch deep and make that first pass. Then I can plunge down just a little bit further and make a second pass. I can repeat that process until I get to the full depth of the mortise. So let's talk more about how this jig works. The jig consists of a base, which allows you to clamp it to your workbench. There's an upright here, which allows support for your stock as you're routing it. There's also a fence that positions the stock. There's a couple clamps on the back here that clamps the stock in place to hold it while you're routing. And then on top we have this platen. Now this platen is designed specifically for this plunge router. The plunge router just fits down here inside the platen. So it fits fairly snug front to back, so there's not much movement, but it allows the router to slide from side to side. So this platen is adjustable front to back. That's how you set the location of the mortise on the end or the edge of your stock. So in other words, for 3/4 inch thickness, you adjust it to where that 1/4 inch bit is centered on the edge of the stock. Once it's adjusted, you can clamp it down in place. Now this platen also has two adjustable stops on both sides. The reason is that allows the router to butt up against those stops, which sets the length of your mortise. So if you want a longer mortise, you adjust these stops out. If you want a shorter mortise, you adjust these stops in. Now the jig allows you to cut both mortises in each piece, but you'll notice that they're in a different orientation. One's on the edge and one's on the end. That means the jig has to hold these work pieces in two different directions. The first one that's cut on the edge, it actually has to hold it in a horizontal position. So the fence is set in the horizontal position for this cut. When you switch to the end, the fence actually rotates around and supports the board straight up and down, which allows you to cut the slot on the end. Now once all this is set up, you can cut these mortises relatively quickly. And that's why I like this type of joinery better than standard mortise and tenon. I also like it because it cuts the mortises in exactly the same spot every time. So once the jig's set up, everything's very repeatable. So that's it for loose tenon joinery this week. But rest assured, we're not going to leave you hanging because there's a lot more to talk about. We're going to cover how to mark the locations of all your mortises with different stock thicknesses. We're going to cover step by step how to set up and use this jig, and then we're going to give you a few little tips on making your own tenon stock. On top of that, we got a couple little tips that'll show you how to make loose tenon joinery look like through tenon joinery. So make sure and tune in next week. Until then, check out our solid carbide router bits at thewoodsmithstore.com.